You have arrived here perhaps drawn by a whisper from your past, or perhaps because something deep within you stirred when you heard the words childhood trauma. If so, then understand this. We are not here to speak of mere psychology or therapeutic buzzwords. No, we gather to examine the invisible architecture that was built in your earliest years, the foundation upon which your entire adult life now rests. When I speak of childhood's influence, I do not speak of simple cause and effect, of a sad story that explains why you struggle with relationships or fear abandonment. I speak of something far more profound, the unconscious blueprint that was carved into your developing psyche before you had words to understand what was happening to you. This blueprint operates like a hidden program, running silently in the background of your adult life, shaping every choice, every reaction, every pattern you find yourself trapped within. The child's mind is not a miniature adult mind. It is something altogether different. A raw, undefended consciousness that absorbs everything without filter, without the capacity to distinguish between truth and distortion, between love and manipulation, between safety and danger. In those formative years when your nervous system was still learning how to navigate the world, every experience became written into your cellular memory like sacred text. But here is what the popular understanding of childhood trauma misses entirely. It is not just the obvious wounds that shape us. It is not merely the dramatic stories of abuse or neglect that create the deepest scars. No, the most insidious damage often comes from the subtle betrayals, the quiet abandonments, the emotional deserts where a child's authentic self was slowly starved of recognition. Picture a young soul learning to read the emotional climate of their home the way a sailor reads the sky for storms. They develop an exquisite sensitivity to the moods and needs of others, not from natural empathy, but from survival necessity. When a parent's love is conditional upon the child's performance, when approval must be earned through silence or perfection or caretaking, the child learns to split themselves in two, the authentic self that must be hidden and the adapted self that must be performed. This splitting is not a choice. It is an unconscious act of preservation. The child's psyche, in its infinite wisdom, protects what is most precious by burying it so deep that even the adult will forget it exists. But the authentic self does not disappear. It goes underground, waiting, calling, creating symptoms and longings and inexplicable hungers that the adult mind cannot understand. I once worked with a woman who came to me because she could not stop apologizing. She apologized for taking up space in elevators, for ordering food at restaurants, for having opinions in conversations. She had built her entire identity around being invisible, accommodating, endlessly grateful for whatever scraps of attention others might offer. When we began to excavate her early years, we discovered not a history of dramatic abuse, but something more subtle and perhaps more devastating. A childhood where her natural exuberance was consistently met with exhaustion, where her needs were treated as burdens, where love was offered only when she made herself small enough to fit into the narrow spaces her parents could tolerate. The child learned that to be loved, she must disappear. And so she spent 40 years of her adult life apologizing for existing, wondering why she felt so empty, so hungry, so perpetually anxious that she might be too much for anyone to bear. This is the long shadow of childhood, not always a dramatic story, but often a quiet erosion of the soul's natural right to be seen and celebrated. But we must go deeper still, for childhood shapes us not only through what happened, but through what did not happen. The absent father teaches lessons just as powerful as the present one. The mother who could not attune to her child's emotional world creates wounds just as deep as the one who actively harmed. These omissions, these gaps in the fabric of early care, create what I call the architecture of emptiness, spaces in the psyche where crucial development should have occurred but did not. Consider the child who never learned that their emotions were welcome, whose tears were met with impatience or dismissal, whose anger was treated as a character flaw to be corrected rather than information to be understood. This child grows into an adult who has no relationship with their own inner life, who experiences their feelings as foreign invaders rather than messengers from the soul. They may become highly functional, successful even, but they walk through life like strangers to themselves, always seeking external validation because they never learned to trust their own internal compass. There is another layer to this mystery that few dare to acknowledge. Childhood trauma is often intergenerational, passed down like an inheritance through the unconscious patterns of families. The parent who was never seen cannot see their child. The parent who learned that emotions were dangerous will teach their child the same lesson, not through words but through the 1,000 tiny moments of disconnection that accumulate over years. I have witnessed this transmission in my practice countless times. The adult who realizes with horror that they are repeating the very patterns they swore they would never inflict upon their own children. The mother who finds herself withdrawing emotionally when her child expresses need, just as her mother did. The father who realizes he has never really seen his son as a separate being with his own dreams and desires, but only as an extension of his own unfulfilled ambitions. This is not failure of character or lack of love. This is the unconscious mind doing what it does, repeating what it knows, even when what it knows is painful. The parent cannot give what they never received. They cannot model emotional attunement if they have no relationship with their own emotions. They cannot provide safety if they themselves are still running from childhood ghosts. The child's developing brain is exquisitely designed to adapt to whatever environment it finds itself in. If that environment is chaotic, the child learns hypervigilance. If it is emotionally barren, the child learns to shut down their own emotional responses. If it is unpredictable, the child learns to constantly scan for danger, to read micro-expressions and vocal tones with the precision of a forensic analyst. These adaptations are brilliant in their own way. They allow the child to survive circumstances that might otherwise overwhelm their developing system. But what serves survival in childhood often becomes a prison in adulthood. The hypervigilant child becomes the adult who cannot rest, who sees threat in every interaction, who exhausts themselves trying to control outcomes that were never theirs to control. The child who learned to dissociate from their body to survive emotional or physical overwhelm becomes the adult who lives entirely in their head, who has no felt sense of their own aliveness, who experiences life as if watching it through glass. The child who took on the role of family caretaker becomes the adult who cannot receive care, who feels guilty for having needs, who builds their entire identity around being indispensable to others while slowly dying of spiritual starvation. But here is what I want you to understand. None of this is your fault. The child you were made the only choices available with the resources they had. Every adaptation, every survival strategy, Every way you learned to navigate an impossible situation was an act of profound intelligence and creativity. The problem is not that you developed these patterns. The problem is that they have outlived their usefulness, and now they keep you trapped in ways of being that no longer serve your adult life. The adult who was once an adaptive child must now face a task that feels impossibly difficult. They must learn to parent themselves in all the ways they were never parented. They must become curious about their own inner world, gentle with their own struggles, fierce in protecting their own authentic needs and desires. They must learn to recognize the difference between the child's voice that still lives within them and their own adult wisdom. This is not simple work. It requires a kind of archaeological excavation of the soul, a willingness to feel things that were too dangerous to feel as a child, to grieve losses that were never acknowledged, to rage about injustices that were normalized as simply the way things were. It requires the courage to see your parents not as the gods they appeared to be in childhood, but as wounded human beings who did the best they could with their own unhealed trauma. And perhaps most challenging of all, it requires you to take responsibility for your adult life while simultaneously holding compassion for the child who had no choices. It requires you to stop waiting for the parent who never came, to stop hoping that if you just try hard enough, love purely enough, achieve spectacularly enough, someone will finally see you the way you needed to be seen all those years ago. The patterns established in childhood do not simply fade with time or positive thinking. They are encoded in the nervous system, wired into the neural pathways, embedded in the very cells of your body. They influence not only how you think and feel, but how you breathe, how you hold tension, how you respond to stress, how you experience intimacy and separation, how you navigate power and vulnerability. I have seen adults whose childhood programming runs so deep that they cannot even imagine what it might feel like to be truly relaxed, to trust that they are safe, to believe that they deserve love simply for existing rather than for what they can provide or achieve. Their nervous systems are locked in patterns of survival that were necessary once, but now keep them from accessing the fullness of their own aliveness. Yet there is something miraculous about the human psyche. It never stops reaching toward wholeness. Even in the most damaged individuals, even after decades of repetitive patterns and unconscious choices, there remains a spark of the original self that refuses to be extinguished. This spark is what calls people into therapy, into spiritual practice, into the difficult work of healing. It is what whispers that there must be another way to live, another way to be. The journey back to the authentic self is not about erasing the past or pretending that childhood wounds do not exist. It is about integration, bringing the fragmented parts of yourself back into conscious relationship, learning to hold both your wounds and your strength, your adaptations and your authentic nature, your survival patterns and your deepest longings. This integration cannot happen through understanding alone, though understanding is crucial. It requires a kind of embodied healing that includes the nervous system, the emotional body, the somatic patterns that were established before language existed. It requires learning to feel safe in your own skin, to trust your own perceptions, to honor your own needs without the crushing weight of guilt or shame. The work of healing childhood's long shadow requires something that our culture rarely teaches: the courage to feel what was forbidden. For most of us, certain emotions were declared unsafe in our family systems, long before we could walk or speak in full sentences. Perhaps anger was met with punishment or withdrawal. Perhaps sadness was treated as weakness or manipulation. Perhaps joy was too threatening to parents who had forgotten how to feel alive themselves. These emotional exiles, the parts of our feeling life that were banished to the underground, do not simply disappear. They live on in the shadows of our adult psyche, creating symptoms, compulsions, and inexplicable reactions that seem to come from nowhere. The adult who was never allowed to be angry as a child may find themselves either exploding in inappropriate moments or so disconnected from their own righteous rage that they allow themselves to be repeatedly violated. The child whose tears brought shame now carries that shame in their body, creating physical tension, chronic pain, or a persistent sense of being fundamentally flawed. But here is what the therapeutic world often misses. Healing these wounds is not simply about processing emotions or gaining insight into patterns. It is about something far more radical. Learning to trust the intelligence of your own organism, to believe that your body holds wisdom your mind cannot access, that your symptoms are not enemies to be conquered, but messengers trying to guide you home to yourself. I recall working with a man whose entire adult life had been shaped by a single moment when he was 7 years old. He had run to his mother in excitement to show her a drawing he had made, his face bright with the pure joy of creation. She looked up from her magazine with annoyance and said, "Can't you see I'm busy? Stop bothering me with your silly pictures." In that moment, something in him died, not dramatically, but quietly, like a candle being snuffed out. He spent the next 30 years of his life believing that his enthusiasm was a burden, that his creative impulses were selfish, that his natural exuberance was somehow wrong. He became a successful accountant, married a woman who reminded him of his mother's emotional unavailability, and lived in a state of persistent, low-level depression that he could never quite explain. It was not until we began to excavate that long-buried moment that he understood why he had spent decades apologizing for taking up space in the world. This is how childhood shapes everything, not through the grand gestures of obvious trauma, but through the accumulation of moments when the authentic self was met with indifference, judgment, or rejection. Each small betrayal teaches the child that who they really are is not acceptable, that love is conditional upon performance, that survival depends upon becoming someone other than themselves. The developing nervous system learns to organize itself around these early experiences of safety and danger, attunement and abandonment. If the primary caregivers are themselves dysregulated, struggling with their own unhealed trauma, addiction, mental illness, or simply the overwhelming stress of adult life, the child's nervous system learns to exist in a constant state of hypervigilance, scanning for threats that may never come, but feeling always on the edge of catastrophe. These early patterns become the template for all future relationships. The child who learned that love meant having to guess what others needed becomes the adult who exhausts themselves trying to read minds and manage moods. The child who discovered that their own needs drove people away becomes the adult who cannot ask for help, who builds walls around their heart and wonders why they feel so alone. But there is something even more subtle at work here, something that touches the very core of human identity. In those early years, before the ego has fully formed, before the child has developed a stable sense of self, they exist in a state of profound openness and vulnerability. They have not yet learned to distinguish between their own emotional experience and that of others. They absorb the psychic atmosphere of their environment like a sponge absorbs water. If that atmosphere is filled with unprocessed grief, unexpressed rage, or unconscious shame, the child takes it in as if it were their own. They may spend their entire adult life carrying emotions that never belonged to them, fighting battles that were never theirs to fight, trying to heal wounds that were created before they were even born. This is the generational transmission of trauma, not just through learned behaviors or family patterns, but through the actual transfer of unmetabolized emotional material from parent to child. The mother who never grieved her own childhood losses passes that grief to her daughter like a genetic inheritance. The father who buried his rage at his own father's absence creates a son who carries that same rage without understanding its source. I have witnessed this phenomenon countless times in my practice. Adults who discover that their deepest struggles are not really their own, but echoes of their ancestors' unfinished business. The woman who cannot stop herself from choosing unavailable partners realizes she is trying to heal her grandmother's broken heart. The man who sabotages every success discovers he is carrying his father's shame about never being good enough for his own father. Breaking these generational patterns requires something that feels almost impossible: the willingness to feel what previous generations could not feel, to grieve what they could not grieve, to rage about what they could not acknowledge. It requires becoming conscious of unconscious legacies, choosing to stop the transmission of unhealed trauma to the next generation. But this work cannot be done through willpower alone. The rational mind, no matter how determined, cannot override patterns that were established before language, before conscious memory, before the prefrontal cortex was fully developed. These early imprints live in the body, in the nervous system, in what we might call the cellular memory of trauma and adaptation. The child who learned to freeze when faced with overwhelming emotion will find themselves as adults unable to move forward in life, stuck in patterns of procrastination and paralysis that no amount of motivation can seem to break. The child who learned to fight or flee will become the adult who cannot sit still, who stays busy to avoid feeling, who exhausts themselves running from ghosts that exist only in their nervous system's memory. Healing these deep patterns requires learning to work with the body's wisdom, to understand that symptoms are not pathology but adaptation, that what we call dysfunction is often the psyche's creative attempt to survive impossible circumstances. The anxiety that feels so overwhelming may be the nervous system's way of staying alert to danger that once was real. The depression that seems to come from nowhere may be the soul's way of protecting itself from feeling too much in a world that taught it feeling was dangerous. The path toward healing is not about eliminating these responses, but about updating them, helping the nervous system recognize that the child is no longer in danger, that the adult has resources the child never had, that what once served survival may now be limiting growth and connection. This updating cannot happen through thinking or analyzing alone. It requires experiences that teach the body a new way of being, that create new neural pathways of safety and connection. It requires learning to breathe into places that have been held tight for decades, to feel the ground beneath your feet when anxiety tries to pull you into the sky, to trust that you can survive the full range of human emotion without being destroyed by it. The work of reclaiming the authentic self is perhaps the most important work any human being can undertake. It is not selfish or indulgent. It is essential not only for personal healing, but for the healing of families, communities, and ultimately the world itself. Every person who breaks the cycle of unconscious repetition, who chooses to feel what was forbidden, who learns to parent themselves with the love they never received, creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond their individual life. Children learn not from what we tell them, but from who we are, from the quality of presence we bring, from whether we have done our own work of integration and healing. The parent who has faced their own childhood shadows can see their child clearly, without the distortion of projection or the fog of unresolved trauma. They can offer what every child needs most: to be seen, accepted, and celebrated for exactly who they are. But even if you never become a parent, even if your healing journey is purely for your own liberation, it matters. Every person who reclaims their authentic self becomes a beacon for others who are still lost in the maze of childhood conditioning. Every individual who learns to love themselves unconditionally creates space for others to do the same. The journey back to wholeness is not linear or predictable. There will be moments of profound breakthrough, followed by periods that feel like moving backward. There will be days when the old patterns feel stronger than ever, when the voice of the wounded child seems louder than the wisdom of the adult self. This is not failure. This is the natural rhythm of deep healing, the spiral path that leads not around the wound but through it, to the gold that lies buried in the shadow. What emerges from this understanding is perhaps the most difficult truth of all: that the child within you is not a metaphor or a therapeutic concept, but a living presence that continues to influence every moment of your adult existence. This inner child carries not only wounds, but also gifts: the capacity for wonder, creativity, spontaneous joy, and an unfiltered connection to life's essential aliveness. Yet for most of us, these gifts remain buried beneath layers of protective armor that we accumulated to survive environments that could not hold our full humanity. The tragedy is not that we developed this armor. It was necessary, even brilliant in its own way. The tragedy is that we forgot we were wearing it. We began to mistake the protective shell for our true identity, the survival persona for our authentic self. We learned to live from the outside in rather than the inside out, constantly scanning the external world for cues about how to be, what to feel, who to become. This external orientation becomes so automatic that most adults have no idea what they actually want, feel, or need. They know what they should want, what would make others happy, what would be appropriate or successful or admirable. But the voice of their own deep knowing has been silenced so long that it sounds like a foreign language when it finally begins to speak. I have worked with countless individuals who came to me with what they described as a spiritual crisis, a sudden, inexplicable emptiness despite outward success, a feeling that they were living someone else's life, a profound disconnection from any sense of meaning or purpose. What they were experiencing was not pathology, but awakening. The authentic self finally refusing to remain buried, demanding recognition and expression after years of exile. This awakening often feels catastrophic because it threatens the entire structure of identity that was built around pleasing others, avoiding abandonment, maintaining control, or simply surviving. The person who has spent 40 years being the responsible one, the caretaker, the achiever, suddenly finds themselves questioning everything. Who would they be if they stopped trying to earn love through performance? What would remain if they stripped away all the roles and masks and adaptive strategies. This existential terror is why so many people retreat from the edge of authentic selfhood back into familiar patterns of unconscious living. The known suffering feels safer than the unknown freedom. The prison of childhood conditioning, however painful, provides a strange kind of security. At least you know the rules, even if those rules are slowly killing your soul. But for those who find the courage to continue this journey of self-reclamation, something miraculous begins to happen. As they learn to feel what was forbidden, to want what was discouraged, to be who they were always meant to be beneath the layers of adaptation, they discover that their authentic self is not the dangerous, selfish, overwhelming force they were taught to fear. Instead, they find a deep wellspring of wisdom, compassion, and aliveness that has been waiting patiently for recognition. The process of healing childhood's influence is not about blame or victimization, though anger and grief are often necessary stops along the way. It is about reclaiming your birthright, the right to exist as you are, to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to take up space in the world without apology or justification. It is about learning to trust the intelligence of your own organism, to believe that your needs matter, that your perceptions are valid, that your authentic expression is a gift to the world rather than a burden. This reclamation requires developing what I call the inner parent, the wise, compassionate, protective part of yourself that can hold space for all the disowned aspects of your being. This inner parent learns to speak to the wounded child within with the kindness and understanding that may have been missing from your actual childhood. It learns to set boundaries not from rigidity but from love, to say no when no is what serves your highest good, to say yes when yes aligns with your deepest truth. The development of this inner parent is perhaps the most important psychological work any adult can undertake. It is the foundation upon which all other growth rests. Without it, we remain forever children in adult bodies, looking to others to provide what we never learned to give ourselves: validation, security, a sense of worth, permission to exist as we are. But cultivating this inner parent is not simply a matter of positive self-talk or affirmations, though these may play a role. It requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience, particularly your pain and struggle. Instead of seeing difficult emotions as evidence of your brokenness, you begin to understand them as information from your psyche about what needs attention, healing, or expression. The anxiety that once felt like an enemy becomes recognized as the nervous system's attempt to keep you safe, perhaps from threats that no longer exist, but once were very real. The depression that seemed like personal failure begins to reveal itself as the soul's way of protecting its tenderness in a world that may have felt too harsh to bear. The anger that was labeled as bad or dangerous shows itself to be life force itself, the energy needed to establish boundaries and protect what matters most. This shift in perspective, from pathologizing your responses to understanding them as adaptive intelligence, is revolutionary. It moves you from being a victim of your own psychology to being a compassionate witness to your own journey. You begin to see that every symptom, every pattern, every seemingly self-destructive behavior was your psyche's best attempt at the time to navigate impossible circumstances. Yet understanding alone, while crucial, is not sufficient for transformation. The patterns established in childhood live not just in your thoughts but in your body, your nervous system, your cellular memory. They influence how you breathe, how you hold tension, how you move through space, how you respond to stress and intimacy and change. Healing these deep patterns requires working with the body's wisdom, learning to feel safe in your own skin after perhaps decades of existing in a state of chronic hypervigilance or dissociation. This embodied healing cannot be rushed or forced. The nervous system has its own timeline, its own intelligence about what can be felt and integrated when. Pushing too hard, trying to heal too quickly, often results in the system shutting down more completely or creating new layers of protection against what feels like another invasion. Instead, the work requires a kind of exquisite gentleness, approaching your own woundedness the way you might approach a frightened animal, with patience, consistency, and respect for the intelligence of the survival responses that have kept you alive. It means learning to breathe with your anxiety rather than against it, to move with your grief rather than away from it, to find the aliveness that exists even within your numbness. The journey back to wholeness is not about returning to some imagined state of childhood innocence. That innocence was lost the moment you learned that the world was not always safe, that love was not guaranteed, that you had to adapt to survive. Instead, it is about developing what we might call mature innocence, the capacity to remain open and vulnerable while also being wise and discerning, to feel deeply while also maintaining healthy boundaries, to love fully while also honoring your own needs and limits. This mature innocence is perhaps the greatest gift of doing your childhood healing work. It allows you to engage with life from a place of curiosity rather than defensiveness, to approach relationships as opportunities for connection rather than battlegrounds for survival, to see challenges as invitations for growth rather than evidence of your inadequacy. As you begin to heal the split between your authentic self and your adapted self, something extraordinary happens in your relationships with others. You stop attracting people who need you to remain small or wounded in order to feel comfortable. You begin to draw toward you those who can see and celebrate your wholeness, who are doing their own work of integration and healing. The patterns that once felt so solid, the tendency to choose partners who cannot truly see you, the compulsion to sacrifice yourself for others' comfort, the inability to receive love or support, begin to shift organically. Not because you are trying to change them, but because the underlying structure that created them has been transformed. You find yourself naturally setting boundaries where once you would have accommodated, speaking truth where once you would have remained silent, choosing yourself where once you would have abandoned your needs for others' approval. These changes do not come from forcing yourself to behave differently, but from a fundamental shift in how you experience yourself and your worth. The world begins to respond to you differently as well. People sense the change in your energy, the solidity of your presence, the authenticity of your expression. Some may be uncomfortable with your newfound wholeness, particularly those who benefited from your unconscious patterns of self-abandonment. Others will be drawn to the light of your authentic being, like moths to flame. This shift in how others respond to you can be disorienting at first. You may find yourself grieving relationships that cannot accommodate your growth, feeling lonely as you outgrow familiar patterns of connection. But gradually, you begin to attract people who can meet you at the level of your authenticity, who celebrate your wholeness rather than requiring your woundedness. The healing of childhood's influence ripples out into every area of life: your work, your creativity, your relationship with your body, your connection to something larger than yourself. When you are no longer spending enormous amounts of energy maintaining false personas or managing the anxiety of not being good enough, that energy becomes available for living, for creating, for contributing your unique gifts to the world. Many people discover, as they heal their childhood wounds, that they have creative capacities they never knew existed, that their authentic voice has something important to say, that their particular way of seeing and being in the world is needed and valuable. The child's natural creativity, which may have been shut down by criticism or neglect, begins to emerge again, not as naive enthusiasm, but as mature artistic expression, innovative problem solving, or simply a more playful and spontaneous approach to daily life. The relationship with your own body often transforms dramatically as well. The body that may have felt like an enemy, holding tension, creating symptoms, betraying you with its needs and vulnerabilities, begins to reveal itself as a wise ally, a source of information and guidance that your thinking mind alone cannot provide. You learn to listen to the subtle signals of fatigue, excitement, attraction, repulsion that your body is constantly offering, using this somatic intelligence to make decisions that align with your deepest truth. Perhaps most profoundly, healing childhood's long shadow opens you to a different relationship with the mystery of existence itself. When you are no longer trapped in the narrow confines of survival consciousness, when you have reclaimed your birthright to exist as you are, you become available for something larger, call it spirit, meaning, purpose, or simply the profound interconnectedness of all life. The child who was forced to close their heart to survive begins to risk opening it again. The adult who learned to see the world as fundamentally unsafe begins to recognize the beauty and possibility that exist alongside the pain and struggle. This is not naive optimism or spiritual bypassing. It is the hard-won wisdom of someone who has traveled through their own darkness and emerged with their capacity for wonder and love intact. This transformation is not a destination, but an ongoing process, a daily choice to remain conscious rather than falling back into automatic patterns, to choose love over fear when both options are available, to honor your own becoming while also holding space for others on their own journey of healing and growth. The work is never finished, and perhaps that is as it should be. Each layer of healing reveals new depths to explore, new aspects of yourself to integrate, new ways of being authentic and alive in an often challenging world. But with each step on this journey, you become more yourself, not the self that was shaped by childhood wounds and adaptations, but the self that was always there underneath, waiting patiently for the conditions that would allow it to emerge and flourish. This is the ultimate gift of facing childhood's influence with courage and compassion, the reclamation of your own life, the freedom to write your own story, the capacity to love and be loved from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. It is perhaps the most important work any human being can undertake, and its effects extend far beyond the individual life to touch every relationship, every creative endeavor, every interaction with the world. The question that haunts every adult who begins to glimpse the depth of childhood's influence is this: how do I know what is mine and what belongs to the programming? How do I distinguish between my authentic desires and the wants that were implanted by caregivers who needed me to be someone other than who I was? This discernment is perhaps the most challenging aspect of reclaiming your true self, because the false persona often feels more familiar, more natural than the authentic being buried beneath it. I have worked with individuals who discovered in their 40s that they had spent their entire careers in professions they never chose, pursuing goals that belonged to parents who lived their unlived dreams through their children. The successful lawyer who realizes they always wanted to be an artist. The dutiful daughter who became a teacher because her mother needed her to be respectable, when her soul longed to travel the world and write poetry. The son who built a business empire to prove his worth to a father who was never satisfied when his deepest joy came from working with his hands in quiet solitude. These discoveries can feel like a kind of death, the death of the identity you thought was yours, the shattering of the life you worked so hard to build. But this death is necessary for rebirth. The false self must be composted before the authentic self can take root and grow. This is not comfortable work. It requires grieving not only what you never had, but what you thought you wanted when it was never truly yours to begin with. The process of distinguishing your authentic voice from the internalized voices of others requires developing what I call inner archaeology, the patient excavation of layers of conditioning to find the bedrock of your true nature. This work cannot be done quickly or carelessly. Each layer must be examined, understood, and consciously released before the next can be safely explored. You begin to notice the difference between thoughts that arise from your own deep knowing and thoughts that carry the emotional signature of someone else's expectations. Your mother's anxiety about money may have become your own financial fears. Your father's rage at his own powerlessness may have become your relationship with authority. Your family's unspoken rules about what emotions were acceptable may have become your own internal censorship system. But here is what makes this work so challenging. These internalized voices do not announce themselves as foreign. They feel like your own thoughts, your own values, your own fears and desires. They have been woven so completely into the fabric of your identity that removing them can feel like pulling threads from a tapestry. You fear the whole thing might unravel, and perhaps it must. Perhaps the complete unraveling of the false self is exactly what is required for the authentic self to emerge. This is why the healing journey often feels like madness, why people in the depths of this work sometimes question their sanity. The solid ground of their constructed identity is shifting beneath their feet, leaving them temporarily without bearings, without the familiar landmarks that once guided their choices. In this space of unknowing, this dark night of the soul, something remarkable can happen if you have the courage not to fill the emptiness too quickly with new identities or distractions. In the silence between who you thought you were and who you are becoming, your authentic voice begins to whisper. At first, it may be so quiet you barely notice it. After years of being drowned out by louder, more insistent voices, it has learned to speak softly, tentatively, like a child who has been told too many times to be quiet. Learning to hear this voice requires developing an entirely different kind of listening, not the listening of the mind that analyzes and categorizes and judges, but the listening of the heart that simply receives without agenda. It requires spending time in silence, in solitude, in the kind of stillness that our culture teaches us to fear. It requires learning to be comfortable with not knowing, with uncertainty, with the vast spaciousness that exists when you stop trying to control every outcome. This authentic voice speaks through the body as much as through thoughts. It communicates through sensations. the expansion in your chest when something is truly right for you, the contraction when something violates your deeper knowing, the aliveness that flows through you when you are moving in alignment with your true nature, the deadness that settles over you when you betray yourself for others' comfort. But learning to trust these subtle signals requires healing the relationship with your own body that was damaged in childhood. Many of us learned early that our bodies could not be trusted, that physical sensations were inconvenient, that bodily needs were burdens, that the wisdom of our organism was less reliable than the rules and expectations imposed from outside. The child who was told they were not really hungry when they asked for food learns to distrust their body's signals. The child whose tears were met with punishment learns that their emotional responses are dangerous. The child whose natural exuberance was consistently dampened learns that their aliveness is too much for others to handle. Healing this split between mind and body, between thinking and feeling, between what others say is true and what your own organism knows to be true, is essential for reclaiming your authentic self. It requires learning to inhabit your body fully, to feel what you feel without immediately trying to fix or change or understand it, to trust that your somatic experience carries intelligence that your rational mind cannot access. This embodied knowing becomes your compass as you navigate the complex process of distinguishing between authentic desires and conditioned responses. When you are considering a choice, a relationship, a direction in life, you learn to pause and feel into your body's response. Does this possibility create expansion or contraction? Does it generate energy or drain it? Does it feel like movement towards something alive and meaningful, or movement away from something you are afraid to face? These questions cannot be answered by thinking alone. They require the full participation of your sensing, feeling, intuitive self, the parts of you that were often dismissed or devalued in childhood but hold keys to your liberation as an adult. As you develop this capacity for embodied discernment, you begin to make different choices. You find yourself saying no to opportunities that once would have seemed too good to refuse, but that your body tells you are not aligned with your deeper truth. You begin saying yes to possibilities that your mind might judge as impractical or risky, but that generate a quality of aliveness you recognize as your authentic self coming online. This shift in how you make decisions often creates conflict with others who have grown accustomed to your conditioned responses. Family members may be confused or threatened when you stop playing the roles they need you to play. Friends may feel abandoned when you're no longer available for the kinds of connections that drain rather than nourish you. Romantic partners may struggle when you begin setting boundaries around your time, energy, and emotional availability. These relational challenges are often the most difficult aspect of reclaiming your authentic self. The people who love you or believe they love you may actually be attached to the false persona you developed to survive your childhood. They may resist your growth because it threatens the familiar dynamics that have defined your relationships, even if those dynamics were unhealthy or unsustainable. This is where you discover whether your relationships are based on genuine love and mutual growth, or on unconscious contracts that require you to remain small, wounded, or available for others' projections. Some relationships will not survive your healing. Others will deepen and become more authentic as you model what it looks like to live from integrity rather than adaptation. The people who truly love you, who see and celebrate your essential self rather than needing you to be who they want you to be, will support your journey toward wholeness, even when it creates temporary discomfort or requires renegotiating the terms of your connection. They will recognize that your healing serves not only your own liberation, but the health of the relationship itself. But you must be prepared for the possibility that some people in your life cannot or will not make this journey with you. The parent who needs you to remain the dutiful child may never be able to see you as a sovereign adult with your own needs and dreams. The friend who has built their identity around being your rescuer may not know how to relate to you when you no longer need rescuing. The partner who fell in love with your wounds may feel threatened by your wholeness. Grieving these relational losses is part of the healing process. You may find yourself mourning not only the relationships themselves, but the fantasy that if you just loved enough, tried hard enough, explained clearly enough, these important people in your life would finally be able to see and accept your true self. This grief is sacred. It honors both what was and what never could be, clearing space for connections that can hold your full humanity. As you continue this work of differentiation, separating your authentic self from the conditioned responses learned in childhood, you may discover aspects of yourself that feel completely foreign. Talents and interests that were dismissed or discouraged in your family of origin begin to emerge. Parts of your personality that were split off or driven underground start to reclaim their place in your conscious awareness. You might find yourself drawn to forms of creative expression that were never encouraged in your childhood home. You might discover a capacity for leadership that was suppressed because your family needed you to be the follower. You might uncover a contemplative nature that was buried beneath years of hyperactivity designed to earn attention or avoid abandonment. These emergent aspects of self often feel simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Exciting because they carry a quality of aliveness and authenticity that you may not have felt in years. Terrifying because they represent unknown territory, parts of yourself that have no track record, no proven strategies for gaining love or avoiding rejection. Integrating these disowned aspects requires courage and patience. You cannot simply decide to be different and expect the change to feel natural immediately. These parts of yourself need time to develop, space to experiment, permission to make mistakes as they find their expression in your adult life. It is like learning to use muscles that have been atrophied from disuse. At first, they may feel weak, unreliable, prone to cramping when asked to perform. But with gentle, consistent exercise, they begin to strengthen and coordinate with the rest of your system, eventually becoming sources of power and grace you never knew you possessed. This process of integration is not just psychological, it is deeply spiritual. As you reclaim the exiled parts of yourself, as you learn to love and accept the full spectrum of your humanity, you begin to experience what mystics throughout history have pointed toward: the recognition that your essential nature is whole, perfect, and worthy of love exactly as it is. This recognition does not eliminate your human struggles or make you immune to pain and challenge, but it provides an unshakable foundation beneath the fluctuations of daily life, a sense of your own inherent worth that cannot be diminished by external circumstances or others' opinions of you. From this foundation, you begin to live differently. Your choices arise not from fear of abandonment or hunger for approval, but from a deep sense of what serves your highest good and the good of those around you. Your relationships become less about getting your needs met through others and more about sharing the overflow of your own wholeness. Your work in the world becomes an expression of your authentic gifts rather than a performance designed to prove your value. This shift from living from woundedness to living from wholeness is perhaps the most profound transformation a human being can undergo. It affects every aspect of existence: your relationship with your body, your sexuality, your creativity, your capacity for intimacy, your connection to the natural world, your sense of purpose and meaning. Yet this transformation cannot be forced or rushed. It unfolds according to its own organic timing, often in ways that surprise and humble you. You may think you have integrated a particular aspect of your childhood conditioning only to discover new layers that require attention. You may believe you have healed a specific wound only to find it activated by unexpected circumstances or relationships. This is not failure. It is the spiral nature of deep healing. Each time you revisit familiar territory, you do so from a different level of consciousness, with greater resources and understanding than you had before. What once felt overwhelming may now feel manageable. What once triggered automatic responses may now invite conscious choice. The journey of healing childhood's influence is ultimately a journey of coming home to yourself, not the self you learned to be in order to survive, but the self you were before you learned to be anyone other than exactly who you are. This self was never broken, never needed fixing, never required improvement to be worthy of love and belonging. This self has been waiting patiently beneath all the layers of adaptation and protection, holding space for your return like a loyal friend who never lost faith in your essential goodness. When you finally arrive at this reunion, when you recognize and embrace your own authentic nature, you understand that everything you experienced, every wound you carried, every pattern you developed was part of the journey that brought you home. The childhood that shaped you so profoundly was not a mistake or a tragedy to be overcome, but a necessary part of your soul's curriculum. The parents who could not see you clearly were themselves products of their own unhealed childhoods, doing their best with the consciousness they had available. The circumstances that felt so overwhelming were the precise conditions needed to develop the strength, wisdom, and compassion that now characterize your adult self. This perspective does not minimize the real pain and loss that may have been part of your early experience. It does not excuse harmful behavior or suggest that abuse or neglect were necessary for your growth. Rather, it recognizes that your soul is vast enough to hold both the grief of what was and gratitude for what became possible because of it. From this place of integration, holding both the wound and the gift, the pain and the wisdom, the conditioning and the freedom, you become available for something beyond personal healing. You become a healing presence in the world, someone who can hold space for others' pain without being overwhelmed by it, who can see the authentic self in others even when they cannot see it themselves. This is perhaps the ultimate gift of doing your childhood healing work, not just personal liberation, but the capacity to serve something larger than your individual story. When you are no longer trapped in the unconscious repetition of childhood patterns, your life becomes available for conscious participation in the healing of the world. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to model what integration looks like, to demonstrate that wholeness is possible, to offer the kind of presence that might have changed everything for you as a child. You become the adult you needed when you were young, not just for yourself, but for every child, every wounded adult, every soul still struggling to find their way home to themselves. This is how individual healing becomes collective healing, how personal transformation contributes to the evolution of human consciousness itself. The work you do to reclaim your authentic self creates ripples that extend far beyond your individual life, touching everyone who encounters the quality of presence that emerges when someone has truly come home to themselves. The long shadow of childhood may have shaped everything about your early development, but it need not determine everything about your adult life. Through conscious engagement with your own depths, through the courage to feel what was forbidden and reclaim what was lost, through the patient work of integration and the fierce commitment to your own wholeness, you can step out of that shadow and into the full light of your authentic being. This is your birthright. This is your invitation. This is the work that matters most, not just for you, but for all of us who share this human journey of awakening to who we really are beneath the layers of conditioning and adaptation that once kept us safe, but now keep us small. The child you were is not gone. They live on within you, holding gifts of spontaneity, wonder, and undefended love that your adult self needs to be complete. The wounded aspects of that child need your compassion and healing attention. The joyful, creative, authentic aspects need your permission to emerge and play a role in your adult life. Integration means making room for all of it, the pain and the joy, the adaptation and the authenticity, the survival strategies, and the spontaneous aliveness that represents your truest nature. This is the work of a lifetime, the most important work any human being can undertake, and its effects extend into every corner of existence, healing not just the individual, but the collective human story of which we are all part. The question that emerges from this understanding is perhaps the most difficult one any adult can face. How long will you continue to live as if your childhood version of reality is still true? How many more years will you spend organizing your entire existence around threats that no longer exist, around rules that were never yours to follow, around the desperate hope that if you just perform perfectly enough, someone will finally give you the love that should have been your birthright from the beginning? This is not a question that can be answered intellectually. It lives in the body, in the places where your breath grows shallow when certain topics arise, in the tension that grips your shoulders when you anticipate conflict, in the way your stomach churns when you consider disappointing someone whose approval you have spent decades trying to earn. These bodily responses are not weakness or oversensitivity. They are the faithful guardians of a wounded system that learned to protect itself the only way it knew how. But here is what those guardians do not understand. The war is over. The child who needed to scan every face for signs of danger, who learned to read micro-expressions like a survival manual, who developed hypervigilance as a form of early warning system, that child is safe now. The adult you have become has resources that child never possessed. You have choices that were not available then. You have the power to leave situations that do not serve you, to speak truths that were once too dangerous to utter, to claim space in the world without apologizing for your existence. Yet convincing your nervous system of this safety is not a matter of rational argument. The body holds its own intelligence, its own memory, its own timeline for healing. It cannot be talked out of its protective responses any more than you can convince your heart to stop beating through willpower alone. The body must be shown, through experience, through consistent evidence over time, that the world has changed, that you have changed, that what once required armor now invites vulnerability. This showing requires what I call the archaeology of sensation, learning to feel into the places where trauma lives, not as memory but as held energy, as frozen moments when your system could not complete its natural responses to overwhelming experience. The child who could not run from danger may carry that trapped flight energy as chronic restlessness in adulthood. The child who could not fight back may hold that suppressed aggression as chronic tension or inexplicable rage. The child who could not cry for fear of making things worse may carry that unexpressed grief as a persistent heaviness that no amount of positive thinking can lift. These somatic imprints cannot be healed through understanding alone, though understanding provides crucial context. They require what we might call embodied dialogue, learning to communicate with your own nervous system in the language it actually speaks, which is the language of sensation, movement, breath, and felt experience. I have witnessed the profound moment when someone finally allows themselves to feel the rage they suppressed as a 5-year-old, when the adult body completes the fight response that was interrupted decades ago. I have seen the liberation that comes when someone lets themselves collapse into the grief they could never show, when the tears that were forbidden finally find their expression. These are not merely emotional releases, they are neurological completions, the finishing of interrupted biological processes that have been running in the background of the nervous system for years or decades. But this work cannot be done carelessly or without proper support. The body that learned to protect itself through dissociation, through freezing, through leaving itself when staying present felt too dangerous, needs tremendous safety and patience to risk feeling again. Pushing too hard, trying to force these completions often results in the system shutting down more completely or creating new layers of protection against what feels like another violation. Instead, the work requires what I call titration, allowing only as much sensation, only as much feeling, only as much aliveness as the system can integrate without becoming overwhelmed. It means learning to edge closer to the places that hold pain or terror or rage, and then backing away when the intensity becomes too much, returning again when the system has settled, gradually expanding the capacity to be present with what was once too overwhelming to face. This process reveals something extraordinary about human resilience. The same intelligence that created your survival strategies is available to help you transcend them. The body that learned to protect you through hypervigilance can learn to relax into present moment awareness. The nervous system that organized itself around threat can reorganize itself around safety and connection. The heart that closed to protect itself from further wounding can slowly, carefully learn to open again. But this reorganization does not happen in isolation. We are relational beings, and our deepest wounds were created in relationship, which means our healing must also happen in relationship, not necessarily in the same relationships that created the wounds, for those may not be safe or available for repair, but in connections that can hold space for your full humanity without requiring you to edit or perform or manage their comfort with your authentic expression. Finding these healing relationships is not always easy. Your conditioning may draw you toward people who feel familiar, which often means people who replicate the dynamics of your childhood in subtle or obvious ways. The person who learned that love meant walking on eggshells may find themselves attracted to partners whose moods must be carefully managed. The individual who discovered that their worth depended on their usefulness may gravitate toward friendships where they give far more than they receive. Breaking these patterns requires developing what I call relational discernment, the ability to distinguish between connections that nourish your authentic self and those that require you to abandon yourself in order to maintain them. This discernment is not about judgment or criticism of others, but about honest assessment of what serves your healing and growth versus what perpetuates your familiar suffering. Healthy relationships, the kind that can support your healing journey, have certain unmistakable qualities. In them, you feel seen for who you are rather than who you think you should be. Your emotions are welcomed rather than managed or fixed. Your boundaries are respected rather than challenged or ignored. Your growth is celebrated rather than threatened or undermined. Your authentic expression is invited rather than edited or criticized. These relationships may feel strange at first, especially if you are accustomed to connections that require constant vigilance or performance. The absence of drama, the presence of genuine care, the safety to be imperfect, these may actually create anxiety in a system that has learned to equate intensity with intimacy, chaos with love, struggle with worthiness. Learning to receive healthy love, to trust genuine care, to believe that you can be valued for your authentic self rather than your adaptive persona, is often more challenging than learning to identify unhealthy patterns. It requires grieving the fantasy that the people who wounded you will someday see you clearly, will finally give you what you needed all those years ago, will validate your worth in the way that could heal the original injury. This grief is sacred and necessary. Until you mourn what never was and never will be, part of you remains forever waiting, forever hoping, forever trying to earn something that was your birthright from the beginning. The child within you who still believes that if you just love enough, try hard enough, achieve spectacularly enough, someone will finally choose you. That child needs your compassion and your truth. They need to hear from the adult you that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself for others' comfort, that you are choosing yourself in all the ways no one else was able to choose you. This choice, the choice to prioritize your own healing and wholeness, may feel selfish after a lifetime of putting others first. But it is not selfishness, it is spiritual responsibility. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot offer genuine love from an empty well. You cannot model healthy boundaries if you have never learned to honor your own limits. You cannot teach others to value themselves if you continue to demonstrate through your actions that your own needs don't matter. The work of healing childhood's influence is ultimately the work of becoming the person you were always meant to be before the world taught you to be someone else. It is the reclamation of your essential nature from beneath the layers of adaptation and protection that once served your survival, but now limit your aliveness. It is the integration of all the parts of yourself, the wounded and the wise, the vulnerable and the strong, the child and the adult, into a coherent, authentic whole. This integration is not a destination, but an ongoing process, a daily choice to remain conscious rather than falling back into automatic patterns, to choose presence over dissociation, authenticity over performance, self-compassion over self-criticism. It requires developing what I call the inner witness, the part of you that can observe your patterns without being overwhelmed by them, that can hold space for your healing without trying to control the timeline or outcome. The inner witness is not detached or dissociated. It is lovingly present, curious rather than judgmental, patient rather than demanding. It can watch your nervous system activate without immediately trying to calm it down, can notice your old patterns arising without shaming yourself for not being further along in your healing, can feel your emotions without being consumed by them or needing to fix them immediately. Developing this witnessing capacity is perhaps the most important skill for anyone healing from childhood trauma. It provides the stable ground from which you can explore unstable territory, the secure base from which you can risk feeling what was once too dangerous to feel. It is the loving parent you needed as a child, now available within your own consciousness to guide and support your continued growth. From this place of inner witnessing, you begin to see your childhood patterns not as evidence of your brokenness, but as testament to your creativity and resilience. Every adaptation you made, every survival strategy you developed, every way you learned to navigate impossible circumstances was an act of profound intelligence. The problem is not that you developed these patterns. The problem is that they have outlived their usefulness and now constrain rather than protect you. This shift in perspective, from pathologizing your responses to honoring them while also choosing to evolve beyond them, is revolutionary. It moves you from being a victim of your past to being the author of your future. It transforms your relationship with your own psychology from one of criticism and control to one of curiosity and compassion. As this transformation deepens, you may notice that your entire relationship with difficulty begins to change. Challenges that once felt overwhelming start to feel manageable. Emotions that once seemed dangerous begin to feel like valuable information. Conflicts that once triggered your deepest wounds become opportunities to practice new ways of being, to demonstrate to yourself and others that you are no longer the person who had to choose between authenticity and belonging. This is not to say that life becomes easy or that pain disappears. The human experience includes suffering. It is woven into the very fabric of existence. But there is a profound difference between the suffering that serves growth and the suffering that perpetuates unconscious patterns. There is a difference between the pain that connects you more deeply to your own humanity and the pain that keeps you trapped in cycles of repetition and reactivity. The person who has done their childhood healing work can feel deeply without being destroyed by feeling. They can love fully without losing themselves in the relationship. They can give generously without depleting their own resources. They can receive care without feeling burdened by obligation. They can set boundaries without guilt and honor others' boundaries without feeling rejected. These capacities are not personality traits or natural talents. They are skills that can be developed through conscious practice, through the patient work of healing and integration. They require learning to trust your own perceptions, to honor your own needs, to believe that your authentic expression is a gift to the world rather than a burden others must endure. The journey toward this kind of integrated wholeness is not linear or predictable. There will be setbacks and breakthroughs, periods of rapid growth followed by times that feel like stagnation, moments of profound clarity alternating with confusion and doubt. This is the natural rhythm of deep transformation, the spiral path that leads not around your wounds but through them to the wisdom they contain. What sustains you through this journey is not the promise of arriving at some final destination of perfect health or complete healing, but the recognition that each step toward greater authenticity and self-compassion is inherently valuable. Each moment of choosing presence over dissociation, truth over performance, self-care over self-abandonment creates ripples that extend far beyond your individual life. The healing you do for yourself becomes healing you offer to the world. The patterns you break in your own life are patterns that will not be passed on to future generations. The love you learn to give yourself becomes a template for the love you can offer others. The wholeness you reclaim from the fragments of childhood conditioning becomes a beacon for others who are still lost in the maze of unconscious repetition. This is why the work of healing childhood's influence is not selfish or indulgent. It is perhaps the most generous gift you can offer to the collective human experience. Every person who chooses consciousness over conditioning, authenticity over adaptation, healing over unconscious repetition, contributes to the evolution of human consciousness itself. The child you were shaped everything about your early development, created the foundation upon which your adult life was built. But that child was not your final form. They were your beginning. The person you become through conscious engagement with your own depths, through the courage to feel what was forbidden and reclaim what was lost, through the patient work of integration and the fierce commitment to your own wholeness. That person is your gift to the world. The long shadow of childhood need not darken your entire life. Through awareness, compassion, and the willingness to do the difficult work of healing, you can step out of that shadow and into the full light of your authentic being. This is your birthright, your invitation, your most important work. Not just for yourself, but for all of us who share this human journey of remembering who we really are beneath the layers of conditioning that once kept us safe, but now keep us small. The patterns established in your earliest years do not merely influence your thoughts and emotions. They shape the very architecture of your nervous system, the way energy moves through your body, the manner in which you breathe and hold tension and respond to the subtle currents of human interaction. These are not metaphorical influences, but literal, measurable changes in your neurological structure that persist into adulthood like fossils embedded in stone. Consider the child who learned that their emotional expressions were met with withdrawal or punishment. Their developing brain begins to prune away the neural pathways associated with emotional expression, redirecting that energy toward hypervigilance and people-pleasing behaviors. By adulthood, they may find themselves physiologically incapable of accessing certain feelings, not because they choose to suppress them, but because the neural infrastructure for experiencing them was literally dismantled in childhood. This is what I mean when I speak of childhood's invisible architecture. It is not simply that you learned certain behaviors or developed particular beliefs about yourself and the world. The very structure of your consciousness was molded by those early experiences, like clay shaped by hands that left their imprints long after the potter walked away. But here is where the mystery deepens, where we must venture beyond the comfortable territories of psychology and neuroscience into realms that the rational mind prefers to avoid. The child does not exist in isolation. They are embedded in what we might call the psychic field of the family system, absorbing not only direct experiences, but the unspoken emotional currents, the ancestral traumas, the collective shadows that move through generations like underground rivers. I have worked with individuals who carry grief that predates their birth, who weep for losses they never experienced personally, but inherited through the mysterious alchemy of bloodline and belonging. The Holocaust survivor's grandchild who suffers inexplicable anxiety around authority figures. The descendant of slaves who carries a bone-deep terror of speaking their truth even in contexts where such expression would be welcomed and celebrated. These transmissions occur below the threshold of conscious awareness, through mechanisms that science is only beginning to understand. The pregnant mother's stress hormones cross the placental barrier, programming the developing fetus's nervous system for a world that may no longer exist by the time the child is born. The nursing infant absorbs not only nutrients but emotional states through breast milk, taking in their mother's unprocessed trauma, along with the sustenance meant to nourish their growth. The family dinner table becomes a classroom where lessons are taught not through words, but through the quality of silence, the tension in voices, the way certain topics cause the air itself to thicken with unspoken dread. The child learns to read these atmospheric changes with the precision of a meteorologist, developing an early warning system for emotional storms that may never actually arrive but feel perpetually imminent. This hyper-attuned sensitivity, this exquisite capacity to feel into the hidden dimensions of human experience, often becomes the foundation for what we later recognize as intuitive or empathic abilities. But it comes at a cost that few acknowledge. The child who learns to navigate by reading the emotional weather of others often loses touch with their own internal climate, becoming so focused on external atmospheric conditions that they forget they have their own sky. The tragedy is not that children develop these extraordinary sensitivities. In many ways, they represent the pinnacle of human perceptual capacity. The tragedy is that these gifts are rarely recognized as such, rarely cultivated with the care they deserve, rarely integrated in ways that allow them to serve the child's authentic development rather than their mere survival. Instead, the sensitive child is often pathologized, medicated, or simply overwhelmed by stimulation in environments designed for less permeable nervous systems. They learn to see their sensitivity as a burden rather than a gift, a weakness rather than a superpower, something to be hidden rather than honored and developed. I recall a young boy whose parents brought him to me because he claimed to see colors around people, to know things about strangers that he had no logical way of knowing, to become physically ill in certain locations for reasons no one could understand. Rather than recognizing these as signs of extraordinary perceptual gifts, the family had labeled him as troubled, anxious, possibly delusional. Through careful exploration, we discovered that this child was simply more open to dimensions of reality that most adults have learned to filter out. His problems were actually evidence of his intact connection to subtle energies and information fields that the rest of us have been conditioned to ignore. But without proper understanding and support, these gifts had become sources of distress rather than wonder. This is how childhood's influence extends beyond the personal into the transpersonal, beyond individual psychology into collective consciousness. The child who maintains their connection to these deeper currents of awareness often pays a price in terms of fitting into consensus reality, but they also serve as bridges between worlds, as reminders of capacities that all humans once possessed, but most have forgotten. Yet even these gifts, when they arise in childhood without proper context or support, can become twisted into patterns of dysfunction. The child who can feel everyone's emotions may become chronically overwhelmed, unable to distinguish between their own feelings and those of others. The child who can sense danger before it manifests may become paralyzed by anxiety, unable to move through the world with any sense of safety or ease. The developing psyche, in its attempt to make sense of these overwhelming perceptions, often creates elaborate internal systems of meaning and control. The child begins to believe that their sensitivity makes them responsible for others' emotional states, that their ability to perceive suffering means they must fix it, that their openness to subtle information obligates them to carry burdens that were never theirs to bear. These beliefs, formed in the crucible of childhood overwhelm, become the invisible chains that bind the adult to patterns of self-sacrifice and boundary collapse. The grown person who cannot say no, who absorbs others' pain like a psychic sponge, who exhausts themselves trying to heal everyone around them while their own soul withers from neglect. This is often someone whose natural empathic gifts were never properly understood or integrated. But there is another layer to this mystery that we must examine, one that touches the very core of what it means to be human in relationship with others. The child's developing sense of self is not formed in isolation, but in the crucible of attachment, in the quality of attunement they receive or fail to receive from their primary caregivers. When a parent can truly see their child, not as an extension of themselves, not as a project to be perfected, not as a reflection of their own worth, but as a unique being with their own inner world and developmental trajectory, something magical occurs. The child's authentic self is mirrored back to them, validated, celebrated. They learn that who they are is not only acceptable but precious, that their inner experience matters, that they have inherent worth independent of their performance or compliance. But when this mirroring is absent or distorted, when the parent cannot see beyond their own needs and projections, the child faces an impossible choice. They can either maintain connection to their authentic self and risk losing the relationship upon which their survival depends, or they can abandon their true nature in favor of becoming who they need to be to secure attachment and approval. For most children, this is not really a choice at all. The drive for connection, for belonging, for survival itself overrides everything else. And so begins the great splitting, the fundamental alienation from self that characterizes so much of adult suffering. The authentic self goes underground, while a false persona emerges to interface with a world that cannot tolerate the child's true nature. This false self is not evil or pathological. It is a brilliant adaptation, a creative solution to an impossible situation. It allows the child to maintain some form of connection while protecting their essential core from further damage, but it also creates a profound internal division that can persist throughout life, leaving the adult feeling like they are living behind a mask, performing a role, never quite sure who they really are beneath all the layers of adaptation. The cost of this splitting extends far beyond individual psychology. When large numbers of people are disconnected from their authentic selves, when entire generations are raised to prioritize compliance over authenticity, performance over presence, the collective consciousness itself becomes fragmented and unconscious. We see this fragmentation everywhere in our modern world, in the epidemic of depression and anxiety, in the addiction to substances and behaviors that promise to fill the void where authentic selfhood should reside, in the violence and cruelty that emerge when people have lost touch with their own humanity and therefore cannot recognize it in others. But we also see signs of awakening, of a collective remembering that is occurring as more and more individuals choose to undertake the difficult work of reclaiming their authentic selves. Each person who breaks free from unconscious patterns, who chooses healing over repetition, who learns to love themselves unconditionally, contributes to a shift in the collective field that makes it easier for others to do the same. This is why the work of healing childhood's influence is not merely personal therapy. It is spiritual activism, evolutionary work, a contribution to the healing of human consciousness itself. When you reclaim your authentic self, you do not do so in isolation. You become part of a growing movement of awakening beings who are choosing consciousness over conditioning, presence over performance, love over fear. 8. The patterns established in childhood run deep, deeper than most people imagine. They operate at levels of consciousness that precede language, that exist in the body's cellular memory, that influence every breath and heartbeat and dream. But they are not permanent fixtures of your being. They are learned responses that can be unlearned, adaptations that can be updated, neural pathways that can be rewired through conscious engagement and patient practice. The journey of healing is not about erasing your past or pretending that your childhood experiences did not shape you. It is about integrating those experiences in a way that honors both their influence and your capacity to transcend their limitations. It is about recognizing that while you may have been programmed by your early environment, you are not condemned to remain a prisoner of that programming forever. This recognition requires tremendous courage, for it means taking responsibility not only for your healing, but for your continued choices. It means acknowledging that while you may not have chosen the circumstances that shaped your childhood, you do have the power to choose how you respond to those circumstances as an adult. The child within you who was wounded, who adapted, who learned to survive in whatever way they could, that child deserves your compassion, your understanding, your fierce protection. But they do not need to remain in charge of your adult decisions. You can honor their experience while also recognizing that you now have resources, choices, and capacities that were not available to them. This differentiation between your inner child and your adult self is crucial for healing. It allows you to feel compassion for the adaptations you made without being trapped by them, to understand your patterns without being defined by them, to honor your past without being enslaved to it. The work requires learning to speak to different parts of yourself with different voices, offering the wounded child within you the comfort and validation they never received, while also accessing your adult wisdom to make choices that serve your highest good rather than your deepest fears. This internal dialogue is not mere psychological technique, it is a form of spiritual practice, a way of bringing consciousness to the unconscious patterns that operate beneath the surface of awareness. It requires developing what mystics have long called the witness consciousness, the part of you that can observe your patterns without being overwhelmed by them, that can hold space for your healing without trying to control the outcome. From this witnessing perspective, you begin to see your childhood conditioning not as your identity, but as a costume you learn to wear, a role you learn to play. And just as you can change your clothes when they no longer fit or serve you, you can choose to step out of patterns that once protected you but now constrain your growth and aliveness. This stepping out is not a one-time event, but a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice to remain conscious rather than falling back into automatic responses. It requires vigilance without rigidity, awareness without self-judgment, commitment without perfectionism. Some days you will succeed in choosing presence over pattern, authenticity over adaptation. Other days you will find yourself caught in familiar spirals of reactivity and unconsciousness. Both are part of the journey. What matters is not perfection but direction, not flawless execution, but sincere intention to keep growing, keep awakening, keep choosing love over fear whenever possible. The path of healing childhood's influence is ultimately the path of individuation, the process by which you become who you truly are rather than who you learn to be. It is the great work of human existence, the evolutionary imperative that calls each soul toward its fullest expression and deepest realization. This work cannot be done in isolation, for we are relational beings who heal in relationship with others. But it also cannot be done by others for you. Ultimately, you must take responsibility for your own consciousness, your own choices, your own journey toward wholeness. The support of skilled therapists, wise teachers, loving friends, and healing communities can provide invaluable assistance along the way. But the actual work of feeling what was forbidden, grieving what was lost, reclaiming what was abandoned, integrating what was split, this work must be done from the inside by the one who lives within your skin and dreams your dreams and carries your unique piece of the cosmic puzzle. As you undertake this work, you may discover that childhood's influence extends far beyond your personal history into realms that challenge conventional understanding of identity and causation. You may find yourself healing not only your own wounds, but ancestral patterns that have been passed down through generations. You may discover that your individual healing contributes to the healing of collective traumas that affect entire communities or cultures. This is because consciousness is not as individual as we have been taught to believe. We are all interconnected at levels that science is only beginning to map, and the healing work that one person does creates ripples that affect the whole field of human awareness. When you break free from unconscious patterns, you make it easier for others to do the same. When you choose authenticity over performance, you give others permission to drop their masks as well. When you learn to love yourself unconditionally, you become a living demonstration that such love is possible, inspiring others to believe they too might be worthy of acceptance and care. This is how individual healing becomes collective transformation, how personal work contributes to evolutionary change. The child within you, who was shaped by forces beyond their control, can become the adult who shapes the world through conscious choice, loving presence, and authentic expression. The long shadow of childhood need not determine the full trajectory of your life. Through courage, commitment, and compassionate engagement with your own depths, you can step out of that shadow and into the light of your true nature. Not the nature that was conditioned by circumstance, but the essential self that exists beyond all conditioning, the soul that came into this world with its own unique gifts and purpose. This essential self has been waiting patiently for your return, holding space for your homecoming like a flame that never goes out no matter how much darkness surrounds it. When you finally recognize and embrace this deepest aspect of who you are, you understand that everything you experienced, every wound, every adaptation, every moment of suffering, was part of the journey that brought you home to yourself. The childhood that shaped you so profoundly was not a mistake or a tragedy, but a necessary part of your soul's curriculum, the specific conditions needed to develop the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and resilience that now characterize your authentic being. What felt like limitation becomes recognized as preparation. What seemed like damage reveals itself as refinement. What appeared to be curse transforms into blessing. This alchemical transformation, from wound to wisdom, from trauma to transcendence, from conditioning to consciousness, is available to every human being willing to undertake the hero's journey of their own healing. It requires everything you have to give and offers everything you have ever sought in return. The freedom to be yourself, the capacity to love and be loved authentically, the deep satisfaction of living in alignment with your truest nature. The work is never finished, for consciousness is not a destination, but a journey. Not a state to achieve, but a quality to embody moment by moment. But each step toward greater awareness, each choice for authenticity over adaptation, each moment of choosing love over fear, brings you closer to the fullest expression of your unique contribution to the magnificent tapestry of human experience. This is your invitation, your calling, your most sacred work, not just for yourself, but for all of us who share this extraordinary adventure of being human, of learning to love, of discovering what it means to be fully alive in a world that desperately needs what only you can offer. The recognition that consciousness itself can be inherited like eye color or bone structure challenges everything we think we know about individual identity and personal responsibility. The child who enters the world already carrying the unmetabolized grief of their great-grandmother, who breathes in anxiety that belongs to ancestral wars they never witnessed, who feels shame about sexuality that originated in religious persecution 3 generations removed. This child faces a task that extends far beyond what we typically call personal development. I have sat with individuals who discovered that their most persistent patterns were not even their own, but ghostly repetitions of dramas that played out long before their birth. The woman who could never trust her own desires found herself carrying her grandmother's terror of pleasure, learned in a convent where natural impulses were branded as sin. The man who sabotaged every creative endeavor discovered he was enacting his grandfather's buried shame about being an artist in a family that valued only practical pursuits. These discoveries can feel simultaneously liberating and overwhelming. Liberating because they explain struggles that never quite made sense in the context of one's personal history. Overwhelming because they suggest that healing requires not just individual work, but somehow addressing wounds that stretch back through time like roots of an ancient tree. But here is what I have learned through decades of witnessing these profound unravelings. You do not need to heal your entire lineage to free yourself from its unconscious patterns. You need only to become conscious of what you carry, to name what was nameless, to feel what was frozen in time. The moment you bring awareness to ancestral patterns, you begin to transform them. The moment you choose to feel what previous generations could not feel, you start to metabolize pain that has been seeking resolution for decades or centuries. This is the true meaning of ancestral healing. Not some mystical process of communicating with the dead, but the very practical work of completing emotional processes that were interrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. When you finally allow yourself to grieve your great-grandfather's losses, to rage about injustices your grandmother could never safely acknowledge, to feel the terror your ancestors experienced but had to suppress in order to survive, you are not just healing yourself, you are healing the family soul itself. The child's nervous system, still forming its basic patterns of response, absorbs these ancestral currents like a radio receiver picking up signals from distant stations. But unlike a radio, the child cannot simply change the channel or turn off the reception. They must learn to live with whatever frequencies they are tuned to receive, often without any understanding of where these signals originate or what they mean. This creates what I call the mystery of inherited emotion, feelings that arise seemingly from nowhere, reactions that feel disproportionate to present circumstances, fears that have no basis in personal experience, yet feel absolutely real and threatening. The adult who panics in enclosed spaces despite never having been trapped, who feels inexplicable dread around authority figures despite never having been abused by them, who experiences waves of grief that seem to come from some bottomless well of sorrow. These may be ancestral memories seeking completion through a descendant willing to feel them fully. But the child who receives these transmissions rarely has any context for understanding them. They experience the emotions as their own, develop their identity around patterns that may have originated generations ago, spend their lives trying to solve problems that were never theirs to solve. The sensitive child becomes the family's unconscious repository for unprocessed trauma, the one who carries what others could not hold, who feels what others had to numb themselves to survive. This role of emotional container is not chosen consciously. It emerges from the mysterious alchemy of temperament, timing, and circumstance. The child born during a family crisis, the one whose sensitivity makes them most permeable to psychic currents, the one whose arrival coincides with anniversaries of loss or trauma. These children often become the unwitting vessels for family pain that has nowhere else to go. The burden can be crushing, but it also carries hidden gifts. The child who learns to navigate multiple emotional realities simultaneously often develops extraordinary empathy and intuitive abilities. They become skilled at reading beneath the surface of human interaction, at sensing what is not being said, at feeling into the hidden dimensions of relationship and connection. But these gifts come at a cost that our culture rarely acknowledges. The child who spends their energy processing others' emotions has little left for their own development. They may become precociously wise about human suffering while remaining naive about their own needs and desires. They may develop sophisticated strategies for managing others' pain while having no idea how to tend their own wounds. The tragedy is not that such children exist, they serve a vital function in the family system, often preventing complete breakdown by absorbing and containing overwhelming energies that might otherwise destroy the entire structure. The tragedy is that their role is rarely recognized or honored, that they grow up believing their sensitivity is a flaw rather than a gift, that they spend their lives apologizing for carrying burdens that were never theirs to begin with. Recovery from this kind of ancestral entanglement requires learning to distinguish between your own emotional experience and the psychic material you have inherited or absorbed from others. This is not simply an intellectual exercise, it requires developing a felt sense of what belongs to you and what does not. Learning to recognize the difference between grief that arises from your own losses and grief that echoes through generational time. The process often begins with dreams, with images and symbols that seem to come from another era, another life. The woman who dreams repeatedly of a burning village she has never seen. The man who wakes with the taste of hunger from famines he never experienced. The child who draws pictures of events that happened before their birth. These may be ancestral memories breaking through into conscious awareness, seeking recognition and resolution. But distinguishing between personal and inherited trauma is only the beginning of the work. The deeper challenge is learning how to honor what you carry without being imprisoned by it, how to serve as a bridge between past and future without sacrificing your own authentic development to ancestral needs. This requires what I call conscious mediumship, the ability to channel ancestral energies for healing purposes while maintaining your own boundaries and identity. It means learning to feel your grandmother's unexpressed rage without making it your own, to witness your father's buried grief without drowning in it, to hold space for family pain without becoming identified with it as your primary reality. The work is delicate, requiring tremendous discernment and often the support of guides who understand these subtle territories of healing. It cannot be rushed or forced, for the psyche has its own wisdom about what can be integrated when, what ancestral material is ready for conscious processing, and what must remain dormant until the system has developed sufficient capacity to hold it. But when this work is done with proper care and support, the results can be extraordinary. Patterns that seemed immutable suddenly shift. Symptoms that resisted all conventional treatment begin to resolve. The individual discovers capacities and gifts that were buried beneath layers of ancestral conditioning, finding their own authentic voice beneath the chorus of inherited voices that had been speaking through them. Most importantly, they break the cycle of unconscious transmission, ensuring that their own children will not inherit the same unprocessed material that shaped their development. They become what I call ancestral healers, individuals who transform family patterns not through dramatic intervention, but through the quiet, patient work of bringing consciousness to what has been unconscious, feeling what has been frozen, speaking what has been silenced. This transformation affects not only the individual, but the entire family system, often in ways that seem miraculous to those who witness it. Adult siblings who have been estranged for years suddenly find themselves able to connect. Parents who seemed incapable of emotional expression begin to open their hearts. Children who were acting out ancestral trauma suddenly settle into their own authentic development. These changes occur not because anyone is trying to fix or change anyone else, but because the family field itself has been altered by one person's willingness to carry consciousness into previously unconscious territories. When the ancestral patterns are no longer being enacted blindly, when the family pain is finally being felt and integrated rather than passed down unchanged, the entire system can reorganize around healthier possibilities. But this work extends beyond individual families into the collective healing of communities, cultures, and ultimately humanity itself. Every person who breaks an ancestral pattern, who chooses consciousness over unconscious repetition, who learns to transform rather than transmit inherited trauma, contributes to the healing of the larger human story. We are living in a time when these patterns of unconscious transmission can no longer be sustained. The old ways of numbing, suppressing, and passing down unprocessed pain are creating symptoms at every level of society, in our relationships, our communities, our political systems, our relationship with the natural world. The work of ancestral healing is not optional luxury, but evolutionary necessity. The child who was shaped by forces extending far beyond their personal experience can become the adult who shapes the future through conscious engagement with these same forces. They can learn to work with ancestral energies as allies rather than being overwhelmed by them as burdens. They can discover that their sensitivity, rather than being a curse, is actually their greatest gift to the world. This discovery requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the relationship between individual and collective, between personal healing and social transformation, between psychological work and spiritual practice. The boundaries between these domains are far more fluid than our compartmentalized thinking suggests. When you heal your own wounds, you heal wounds in the collective field. When you break patterns in your family system, you make it easier for others to break similar patterns in theirs. When you learn to love yourself unconditionally, you contribute to a shift in consciousness that affects everyone you encounter, often in ways you will never know or understand. This is why the work of healing childhood's influence is so much more than personal therapy or individual development. It is participation in the great work of our time, the conscious evolution of human consciousness itself, the transformation of patterns that have governed human behavior for millennia, the birth of new possibilities for how we can be together on this planet. The child within you who absorbed so much, who carried so much, who adapted to circumstances that would challenge the strongest adult, this child was not a victim, but a hero, taking on impossible tasks with the innocence and courage that only children possess. They deserve not your pity, but your profound respect, not your attempt to fix them, but your willingness to finally understand the magnitude of what they accomplished, and the adult you are becoming through conscious engagement with these depths. This adult has capacities that the child could never have imagined. You have resources now that were unavailable then. You have choices that did not exist in your early environment. You have the power to complete what was left unfinished, to heal what was wounded, to love what was rejected. This is not about changing the past. That is impossible and unnecessary. This is about changing your relationship to the past, transforming how those early experiences live within you now, choosing how you will carry forward the gifts while laying down the burdens that no longer serve your highest development. The work requires everything: your courage, your compassion, your commitment to truth above comfort, your willingness to feel what you have spent years avoiding, but it offers everything in return. Freedom from unconscious patterns, access to your authentic power, the capacity to love and be loved without the distortions of unhealed trauma, the deep satisfaction of living from your essential nature rather than your adaptive strategies. Most of all, it offers the possibility of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of ensuring that the children who come after you will inherit not unprocessed pain, but conscious love, not ancestral wounds, but ancestral wisdom, not patterns of unconscious repetition, but templates for conscious evolution. This is your legacy, your contribution, your gift to the future, not the elimination of all suffering, which is neither possible nor desirable, but the transformation of unconscious suffering into conscious growth, of inherited patterns into chosen responses, of ancestral wounds into evolutionary wisdom. The long shadow of childhood need not darken the rest of human history. Through your willingness to bring consciousness to unconscious patterns, love to unloved places, and healing to wounds that have festered in darkness for far too long, you participate in the dawn of a new chapter in the human story, one written not by victims of the past, but by conscious creators of the future. The moment arrives when you must ask yourself the most difficult question of all. How much longer will you allow the ghosts of your childhood to dictate the choices of your adult life? How many more years will you spend organizing your entire existence around emotional patterns that were formed before you could even speak, around threats that no longer exist except in the neural pathways carved by a child's desperate attempts to survive? This is not a question that can be answered through analysis or positive thinking. It lives in the places where your breath catches when certain memories surface, in the way your body contracts when someone raises their voice, in the familiar ache that settles in your chest when you consider the possibility that you might be fundamentally unlovable. These responses are not character flaws or signs of weakness. They are the faithful guardians of a system that learned to protect itself in the only ways available to a developing mind faced with impossible circumstances. But here is what those guardians cannot comprehend. The child who needed their protection has grown into an adult with resources that did not exist in those early years. You now possess the capacity to leave situations that do not honor your worth, to speak truths that were once too dangerous to utter, to choose relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need for approval. Yet your nervous system continues to respond as if you are still that vulnerable child, still dependent on others for your very survival. The recognition of this gap between your actual current reality and your internal experience of threat can be both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it reveals that much of what feels so urgent and overwhelming is actually an echo from the past rather than a present danger. Terrifying because it means taking responsibility for updating patterns that have been running automatically for decades, for learning to trust your own perceptions when they differ from the survival programming that once kept you alive. This updating cannot happen through willpower or rational understanding alone. The patterns established in childhood live in the body's memory, in the way you hold tension in your shoulders when anticipating conflict, in the shallow breathing that accompanies any hint of disapproval, in the way your stomach churns when someone you care about seems distant or upset. These somatic responses carry the wisdom of your early experience, but they also carry its limitations. The work requires learning to dialogue with your own nervous system, to speak to it in the language it understands. Not words, but sensation, movement, breath, and felt experience. You must become curious about what your body is trying to tell you through its symptoms, its tensions, its persistent patterns of holding and protecting. The chronic pain in your neck may be the physical manifestation of carrying burdens that were never yours to bear. The persistent fatigue may be your system's way of protesting a life that requires constant performance rather than authentic expression. But this somatic dialogue cannot be forced or rushed. The body that learned to protect itself through hypervigilance or dissociation needs tremendous safety and patience to risk feeling fully again. Pushing too hard often results in the system shutting down more completely, creating new layers of protection against what feels like another invasion of its carefully constructed defenses. Instead, the work requires what mystics have long understood as sacred attention, a quality of presence that is simultaneously gentle and unwavering, curious without being demanding, patient without being passive. You learn to approach your own pain the way you might approach a frightened animal, with respect for its intelligence and its right to exist, with understanding that its protective responses serve a purpose even when they no longer serve your growth. This quality of presence begins to transform not only your relationship with your own experience, but your relationships with others. When you are no longer driven by unconscious needs to earn love through performance, to avoid abandonment through constant accommodation, to prove your worth through endless giving, you begin to attract people who can see and celebrate your authentic self, rather than those who require your woundedness to feel comfortable with their own. The shift is often subtle at first. You might notice that you no longer feel the compulsive need to fill every silence in conversation, that you can receive compliments without immediately deflecting them, that you can set boundaries without the crushing weight of guilt that once made such self-protection feel impossible. These small changes ripple outward, affecting every interaction, every choice, every moment of your daily existence. But the transformation also brings losses that must be grieved. Some relationships will not survive your healing because they were built on unconscious contracts that required you to remain small, wounded, or available for others' projections. The friend who could only relate to you through shared victimhood may feel threatened by your growing wholeness. The family member who needed you to play the role of eternal child may resist your emergence into full adulthood. These losses can feel devastating, especially when they involve people you have loved deeply, but they are necessary sacrifices on the altar of authenticity. You cannot serve both your healing and others' need for you to remain unchanged. You cannot honor your own growth while also maintaining relationships that require you to betray your deepest knowing about what serves your highest good. The grief of these losses is sacred work, as essential to your healing as any other aspect of the journey. You must mourn not only the relationships themselves, but the fantasy that if you just loved enough, tried harder, explained more clearly, these important people in your life would finally be able to see and accept your true self. This fantasy dies hard because it carries within it the child's desperate hope that the love they needed would eventually arrive if they could just become worthy enough to receive it. But worthiness was never the issue. You were worthy of love from the moment you drew your first breath, worthy not because of what you could provide or achieve, but simply because you existed. The tragedy of childhood is not that you were unworthy, but that the people meant to mirror your inherent value were themselves too wounded, too unconscious, too overwhelmed by their own unhealed trauma to offer the recognition and celebration that every child deserves. Understanding this intellectually is one thing. Integrating it at the cellular level is quite another. The process requires what I call archaeological feeling, the patient excavation of layers of buried emotion, the willingness to feel what was too dangerous to feel when it first arose, the courage to let your body complete responses that were interrupted by circumstances beyond your control. The child who could not cry for fear of making things worse may need to sob for hours, releasing decades of accumulated grief. The child who could not express anger without risking abandonment may need to rage safely, finally giving voice to the fury that has been eating them alive from the inside. The child who learned to freeze when overwhelmed may need to shake and tremble, allowing their nervous system to discharge the trapped energy of incomplete responses. These releases are not mere emotional catharsis. They are neurological completions, the finishing of biological processes that have been running in the background of your system for years or decades. When they occur in an environment of safety and support, they free up enormous amounts of energy that can then be available for creativity, connection, and the full expression of your authentic self. But the work extends beyond individual healing into something far more mysterious and profound. As you reclaim the disowned parts of yourself, as you learn to love what was rejected and honor what was hidden, you begin to discover that your personal healing is intimately connected to the healing of the larger human story. The patterns you break in your own life are patterns that will not be passed on to future generations. The love you learn to give yourself becomes a template for how you can love others. This recognition transforms the entire meaning of your suffering. What once felt like personal pathology reveals itself as participation in the great work of human evolution. The slow transformation of our species from unconscious reactivity to conscious choice, from inherited trauma to chosen response, from patterns of domination and submission to new possibilities for authentic relationship and mutual recognition. Every moment you choose presence over dissociation, authenticity over performance, self-compassion over self-criticism, you cast a vote for the kind of world you want to live in. Every time you break an unconscious pattern, you make it slightly easier for others to break similar patterns in their own lives. Every act of self-love contributes to a shift in the collective field that affects everyone you encounter, often in ways you will never know or understand. This is why the work of healing childhood's influence is not selfish indulgence, but the most generous gift you can offer to the world. When you are no longer trapped in unconscious repetition of old wounds, when you are no longer driven by the desperate needs of your unhealed child, you become available for something larger than your personal story. You become a conscious participant in the evolution of human consciousness itself. The child within you who absorbed so much, who adapted so brilliantly, who survived circumstances that would challenge the strongest adult. This child was not a victim, but a hero, accomplishing the impossible with the resources available to an immature nervous system. They deserve not your pity, but your profound respect, not your attempts to fix them, but your commitment to finally understand the magnitude of their achievement. And the adult you are becoming through this conscious engagement with your depths. This adult has capacities that the child could never have imagined. You have the power now to complete what was left unfinished, to heal what was wounded, to integrate what was split. You can become the loving parent to yourself that you needed all those years ago, offering your inner child the recognition, protection, and unconditional acceptance that may have been missing from your early experience. This is the ultimate gift of facing childhood's long shadow with courage and compassion. The reclamation of your birthright to exist as you are, to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to take up space in the world without apology or justification. It is the freedom to write your own story, rather than living out the unconscious scripts handed down through generations of unhealed trauma. The journey is not easy, and it is never truly finished. There will always be new layers to explore, new aspects of yourself to integrate, new ways of being authentic in an often challenging world. But each step toward greater consciousness, each choice for love over fear, each moment of choosing yourself while also holding space for others contributes to the great work of our time, the transformation of human suffering from unconscious repetition into conscious evolution. This is your invitation, your calling, your most sacred responsibility, not just to yourself, but to all of us who share this extraordinary adventure of being human. The child you were shaped everything about your early development, but they need not determine everything about your adult life. Through awareness, courage, and the patient work of integration, you can step out of childhood's long shadow and into the full light of your authentic being. The patterns may run deep, deeper than you ever imagined, but you run deeper still. Beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the adaptations, beneath all the survival strategies that once kept you alive but now keep you small, there exists the indestructible core of who you truly are, whole, worthy, and infinitely capable of transformation. This is not the end of your story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one written not by the wounded child of your past, but by the conscious adult of your present, in service to the healed human you are becoming and the world that desperately needs what only you can offer.